Societies and economies around the world are being transformed dramatically and irrevocably. The great transition from an agrarian to an urban industrialized society lies behind the extraordinary improvements in our standards of living. It lies also behind the existential challenge facing humanity today. This great transition began in Europe and North America in the late 18th century. But even today, only 40% of the world's population has completed the transition or are very close to completion. The remaining 60% of the world are at the early stages of catching up and becoming urban industrialized. This helps us understand the global challenges we face today and offers a reliable guide to how the next 100 years will unfold. From this perspective, there can be no doubt that the future looks bleak, and we need to better understand the transition so as to prepare for the future and perhaps mitigate the worst risk, the risk of civilizational collapse. Above all, the author of this course seeks to develop a framework, a common language to discuss the true source of the pressures on our environment and society. The challenges facing us are complex, and that is an understatement. The framework allows for collaboration and effective sharing of ideas. It helps us quickly identify core underlying issues. The 4Waves approach gives you the tools to identify these megatrends' influence on your sector. For over 10,000 years, since the transition from a hunter-gatherer society, countries and societies operated in the agrarian era, stuck in a zero-growth Malthusian trap. Then, at the end of the 18th century, humanity began its transition to an urban industrialized era that transforms almost every aspect of their societies and economies. This great transformation is formed of multiple smaller transitions, the most important of which are the economic, demographic, dietary, and energy transitions. Let's go through the transitions and their indicators one last time. We have an economic transition from millennia-long stagnation to GDP growth. As an economy goes through the transition, it moves from almost zero growth to 10 to 15% during the transition to back below 2% or possibly lower once complete. GDP per capita increases from below $1,000 GDP per capita to over $20,000. So a country with a per capita GDP of $20,000 is likely to have completed the economic transition. There is a demographic transition. The death rate falls from 40 per 1,000 people to 10 per 1,000, and the number of children per woman falls from more than 6 to less than 2. Since the birth rate falls more slowly than the death rate, countries going through the demographic transition experience a demographic boom. This demographic boom saw the world's population increase by over 4.5 billion in the 20th century. The same boom is still ongoing, and this century will see our population again grow by more than 4.5 billion to reach 11 billion or so in 2100 before declining. There is a dietary transition. In agrarian societies, people eat 300 to 400 kilograms of food per year per capita, and this rises to closer to 900 kilograms in urban industrialized societies. These diets are more varied. This sees their calorie intake increase from 1.5 thousand kilocalories per capita per day to 3.5 thousand kilocalories. Varied, richer diets lead to healthier and more productive lives. There is a transition from isolated small settlements to cities. This is measured by an urbanization indicator for the percentage of the population living in cities. The urbanized population increases from between 5 to 20% in an agrarian society to 75% or more in an urban industrialized society. We have an energy transition, without which no other transition would be possible. This crucial transition sees societies no longer depend simply on human and animal muscle and biomass. The transition brings access to new energy technologies. This can be measured by energy consumption per capita increases from as low as 500 kilowatt hours per capita per year to 30,000 kilowatt hours per capita or more. There are, of course, many, many more transitions and indicators. All these transitions have environmental costs, including the byproduct of greenhouse gas emissions. The urban industrialized society at the beginning of the 21st century produced around 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita per year. When we look at the world today, we see that not all countries have the same level of human development. What we can also see is that this is not because some countries are doomed to forever remain agrarian. Some countries simply start later than others, and we can group countries based on where they are on each of the transitions. We have identified 4 groups or waves of countries. Countries in each wave begin their great transition as agrarian societies, whether or not they began 250 years ago or 20 years ago. Despite the apparent huge difference between the countries, they made and are making this transition following a very similar trajectory. Recognizing the still early stage in the great transition many countries are in, we can see that closing the gap between the first wave and the other waves will result in enormous increases in global consumption this century. The urban population will increase by another 4 billion, double what it is today. We will need to double steel and cement production. Food consumption will also double, as will energy consumption. Other sectors will see even higher growth. We can expect the number of cars to increase by possibly as much as 5 or 6 times, from 1 billion today to 5 or 6 billion. These indicators show our progress. They show a society achieving a far higher standard of living for its citizens. It also shows the unbearable pressures we are placing on our planet. This transition cannot be stopped or reversed, nor should the fact that the first wave had a 200-year head start on the fourth wave make any of us believe the first or even second wave have any innate characteristics that mean only they can complete such a transition. All countries will complete the transition. It is only a matter of time. The second wave are already 60 to 80% of the way to completion. We can expect them to complete the process by the middle of this century. Meanwhile, the third wave is well underway, about 30 or 40% complete. We can expect the third wave countries to complete their transition in the final decades of this century. And any visitor to the fourth wave to countries such as Nigeria or Tanzania will see the transition has begun there as well. Most fourth wave countries' transitions are between 10 and 30% complete. Their journey will only be complete by the beginning of the 22nd century. We cannot deny that improved living standards for each and every individual is a victory and desirable. But at the global level, multiplied by billions, all these improvements only bring us closer to collapse. There are those who doubt that the fourth wave, sub-Saharan Africa, can make the transition. There were similarly those who doubted China and other second-wave countries. Yet, over the past 60 years, they have made incredible progress and almost closed the gap. Few now doubt India and other third-wave countries' ability to do the same. There are multiple historical, social, and political reasons why some countries begin later than others. They have been covered very well by others. This helps us to understand why we are not on target to limit global temperature increases to 2 degrees. If the world were more or less static, as it is today, then maybe we could be slightly more optimistic. Perhaps the first and second wave countries could transform their infrastructure quickly enough to have emissions by 2050 and bring them to zero by 2070. It would be far from certain, of course. The technologies that allow the Great Transition took 150 to 200 years to develop. We need decades more to develop all the necessary technologies, make those technologies work at scale, and replace existing infrastructure. Some technologies do exist, but they cover only a fraction of the emission-emitting technologies we use today, and fewer still are ready for scale. But while these technologies are being developed, the infrastructure is already being built in the third and fourth waves, following the same blueprint as in the first and then second waves. The world is not static, and humanity is in a 300-year transition. We must therefore be prepared for a 3 or 4 or quite possibly a 6-degree increase in global average temperatures. and we understand that 2 degrees is already a disaster. The megatrends that have driven the world the past 250 years are not yet complete, and so we can reasonably expect them to continue, allowing us to make strong assertions about the next 100 years. The Great Transition will continue in the third, fourth, and even second wave, leading to a doubling in global demand for energy, food, urban infrastructure, and other resources. This will result in increased environmental problems, not only climate change. But certainly the climate will continue to deteriorate, and we will witness ever more disturbing impacts as a result. We must therefore be prepared for a 3 or 4 or quite possibly a 6-degree increase in global average temperatures. The current approach focused on bringing emissions to zero will be abandoned in favor of severe and risky solutions. Such solutions will include geoengineering, directly cooling the planet, and direct air capture to remove carbon from the atmosphere instead of attempts to bring our emissions to zero. These approaches may help, but risk further destabilizing the situation on the planet. We might hope we will also see a real effort towards a memorandum on logging in the world's remaining natural forests and securing large-scale afforestation. This is a slow process, but may be the most important solution for our future. We also see another challenge on the horizon. The centuries-long period of growth will come to an end as first the first wave and later in other waves complete their transition. Wave after wave will enter into a period of global decline and degrowth. This will bring to humanity very new challenges during the next couple of centuries. So, what does this mean? We need to radically change our focus. We must stop viewing the challenge of the 21st century from the perspective of climate change. We need to focus on the broader picture across the next 100 years. Numerous existing international agreements do exist on everything from climate emissions to protecting certain areas of the ocean from fishing and mining. However, they are not integrated into a much broader picture. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are the closest we come. Yet they focus only on the next 10 years and do not have the necessary depth. Nothing short of a 100-year globally enforced plan addressing the multiple interconnect challenges of the 21st century is needed. It may well be the only way to enforce such an agreement would be through the creation of a new political authority at the supranational level with real political power. This idea may disturb many, but we must recognize that the challenges we face cannot be solved at the national level or even through international cooperation. These challenges can only be solved through global direct governance. Both political and business leaders are coming under increasing pressure from activists across the planet. Yet, without a framework, it is hard to either identify or evaluate the resulting actions. Our understanding of the Great Transition and the 4 Waves allows us both to understand where growth in consumption will take place and why it is needed. It also shows us that there are essentially 3 scenarios for 2100. Firstly, there is a prosperity for all scenario, in which everyone is able to make the Great Transition, and somehow we find a way to not make the Earth uninhabitable in the process. This is what many techno-optimists strive towards. In this scenario, we can achieve a new technological transition and fix all environmental challenges at unprecedented speed. It would be nothing short of a miracle. There is a less positive outcome, a rationing scenario. In this scenario, we find we can reduce the very worst environmental disasters, but only by rationing the limited resources we have in an equitable way. This would certainly require first and second wave countries to reduce their absolute consumption. Such reductions would need to remain until the world population falls to well below today's levels, that is in the 22nd century. Whether or not this scenario occurs, we will hear ever more about degrowth. Not sustainable growth, but real and absolute reductions in food, energy, and resource consumption. We need to restrict our lifestyles to become more modest. Then there is the collapse scenario, where over the course of 100 years, or perhaps more quickly, society collapses, much as human civilizations have collapsed in the past. Humanity faces an unprecedented challenge to its survival in the 21st century, the result of its own success. In our lifetimes, we will be faced ever more frequently with the negative impacts of the Great Transition. We cannot prevent that. What we can hope for and work to prevent are those impacts becoming so great our civilization does indeed collapse. If we recognize the roots and scale of the challenge, then we can become informed activists. Now that you have studied the big picture with the help of the 4Waves framework, what do you think should be done? How can we together avoid disaster and achieve prosperity?